Welcome to It's Complicated, a conversation series at the Autry Museum located on Tongva homelands in Los Angeles. This series brings together a variety of voices to discuss the legacies of historical people, places, and events, which are sometimes difficult and regrettable. We will leave it to others to put figures up on pedestals or take them down. Our question is, how do we today choose to live with the history we have inherited and use it to move forward?
Well, hi, everybody. I'm Virginia Scharff, and I'm senior scholar at the Autry Museum of the American West. And I'm here today with my friend Heather Cox Richardson. She's professor of history at Boston College, and she's certainly an expert on political and economic history, author of 6 books on American politics. And that includes most recently a book that has really made a mark on my brain and on the field of American history: How the South Won the Civil War, Oligarchy, Democracy, and the Continuing Fight for the Soul of American. We've become friends on social media, and I met her through Facebook and through Twitter. She's a leading Twitter historian, and she has explained the historical background on modern political issues through Twitter threads that I find absolutely stunning, because I certainly don't have the patience to engage the kind of people that read Twitter threads and respond to them and have to deal with them in a way that is both provocative, convincing, and lively. So it's great to be here with Heather. I should add that she's the co-editor of We're History, a web magazine of popular history, which is a great read, and the author of a very, very popular newsletter, Letters from an American, a chronicle of American politics. I can't believe she gets these things out every single day. She's indefatigable. Welcome, Heather Richardson.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here.
It's great to see you. And one of the things that we've talked about is the fact that you have often visited the Autry Museum, that you were able to get out west and see family, and you made a point of getting to the Autry, and you liked the things that you found in our museum.
Yes, well, I've only been once and I loved it. This is one of the reasons I'm so excited to be here now, because it is a spectacular museum. It's not only the incredible collections that I hope we'll talk some about, but the interpretation of them. Because once you've been in this field for a while, you kind of know like what's out there, like the books and all that. But to see that brought to life with the actual objects was we were there. There weren't a lot of people when we were there. Now I can't remember when we were there, but you couldn't drag us out. I mean,
Yeah.
it was great.
Well, we worked really hard to try to give people a broader understanding of what the American West is and why it matters for American history. And in fact, why it matters for not only the past, but the present and the future. That's what we'd like to we talk about this all the time in any kind of interpretive meeting. And we obviously are identified with the iconic American popular culture cowboy, the TV cowboy, the movie cowboy, Gene Autry. But you've shown us how the figure of the cowboy is really a much more important figure than just somebody who we saw on Saturday morning TV, although Saturday morning TV is nothing to sneeze at. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the way that you approach the idea of the cowboy in American history.
Well, so interesting, because you think about that and the fact that there's an entire museum that is associated with the cowboy. Although, of course, the Autry does so much more than that. That's kind of a weird thing, isn't it? Like that there's this incredible museum with the phenomenal paintings you've got, and the firearms, and the Indian motorcycle, which I believe
Right.
Indian motorcycles were built in Massachusetts, if I'm correct on that.
I
But
believe, yeah, I think so. Our museum has the second largest collection of native objects that are associated with native peoples in the United States after the Smithsonian. So we are not just a cowboy museum. We were founded by Gene Autry, but certainly our native collections are something that we think are such an important central part of how we understand what happened in the history of the American West. And we we like to put objects that evoke both popular culture around Native people, but then also the presence and the creations and the expressions and the vision of Native peoples in conversation with other objects in the museum.
I remember being blown away by the fabrics. They're just absolutely beautiful textile collection as well. But it's interesting when you think about that and the fact that we had television, so many television stars who were cowboys, and that we had all those. I think at one point in the 1950s, there were 26 TV cowboy shows on at one time. And not at the same moment, but at the same era. I mean, really funny that it became such an incredibly popular image. And one of the things that I like to point out is it is our primary image of Reconstruction. I mean, when people think about Reconstruction and the way we teach Reconstruction, we focus on primarily the African American experience in the American South. And yet, most Americans couldn't identify a picture of Robert Smalls or Hiram Revels, but everybody knows the American Cowboy. Right. And why did that American Cowboy become so iconic in that period, and in such a way that it really the myth of the cowboy so completely overwrote the reality of the cowboy, which again is something that the Autry does so well. You know, in mythology, the cowboy is white. He's a young white man who wants nothing from the government, although in reality, the government did more for the American West than it did for any other region of the country. And he's just trying hard to make it on his own and work hard, and he's working his way to prosperity. Whereas again, as historians, we know that the actual capitalization of the cattle industry meant that cowboys were equivalent to industrial workers in the American East. So where and why did that image develop the way it did? And one of the things that my work has uncovered in various times and in various books is the cowboy during the Reconstruction period was really lionized as the person who stood against what people increasingly talked about as communism or socialism back east. And what they meant by that was the federal government was using its muscle to try and level the playing field between Black Americans and Euro Americans. And people who objected to the inclusion of African Americans in the body politic interpreted that as a leveling in which men, they're really focusing on men in terms of voting, but men who had previously worked in the fields and didn't own property were voting for politicians who would give them things like roads and hospitals and schools that cost tax dollars. And it would be white people who paid those tax dollars. So they actually conceived of that as a redistribution of wealth that they associated with socialism or communism. At the same time, they were able to talk about this American cowboy, this young white man who just wants to work hard. But what's interesting about that is that with that imagery comes not only the stance against the idea of socialism or communism as a political structure, but also the idea that this cowboy represents not only individualism, but also domination over the indigenous people, the African Americans who are in the South, the Asian Americans, the Mexicans, and the Mexican Americans. And into the West becomes transferred the kind of ideas of social castes and social hierarchies that previously had characterized the American South. So it's an incredibly fraught and complicated image for all the fact that it's so easily sort of absorbed into so many different narratives, especially after World War II.
Well, and we've been trying to complicate the cowboy ever since the Autry Museum opened in the 1980s. And you've been to the galleries, you've seen the pictures of the incredible diversity of even pop culture cowboys, movie cowboys, TV cowboys, Black cowboys, cowgirls, everybody from Annie Oakley to Thelma and Louise as a Western figure in our imagination gallery. But I think it's really interesting to think about the whole question of individualism versus a kind of, the role of the state in the building of the American West and the claiming and the conquest of the American West. Because as you just said, the idea of an individual out there in free, empty space, just, working hard enough to get what is his because there's nobody else there who really has a valid claim to it. And that really, what it says to you is that a white male individual really has a valid claim to anything. as long as the state doesn't get in its way, and as long as these purportedly inferior people, whether they are people of color, whether they are indigenous occupants or other or immigrants who come into the Western space, like white immigrants, or whether it's women, contesting for the vote, it all seems a little out of place when you have a kind of legitimation of this white male authority that, because he works hard, he gets what he wants. And I think that this is still, it's something that I think we live with we don't think about it all the time, but we certainly live with it, not only in our iconography, but in our politics today.
Well, it certainly comes into politics, and that's actually what has always fascinated me in all of my studies is the relationship between the reality of something and what we believe about it, because they're rarely the same thing. And the Cowboy is a great example of that because, I actually teach an entire course in, it's called The Frontier in the American Mind, where I lecture, all of the lectures is on the reality, what's on the ledger books, what we know about, what were the demographics, what were the pay like. And this is for all of the history of the American West, not simply, or the history of the frontier, not simply the Cowboy, but then the students read documents from the time about the way people are conceiving. And it's almost like they're two separate courses. You've got, we start with Flint, Louis L'Amour's Flint. And, when we work our way through Laura Ingalls Wilder, and who of course wrote her books as an anti-New Deal screed. And, we work our way through the mythology right up to Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush, and the adoption of that cowboy image in the period, especially after 1980, as a political weapon, really, to say we're going to get rid of the New Deal in America. And we're going to return to this earlier, simpler time in which you had good and evil, the individualist versus communism, and it's all symbolized by the American Cowboy. There's a wonderful image from a radio show that Rush Limbaugh did, and it was a series called I think it was called My Cowboy. And it was Rush Limbaugh talking about why he loved George W. Bush, because George W. Bush was a cowboy, and cowboys wore the white hats and the bad guys wore the black hats, and the cowboys always got their man, and everybody else sympathized with the bad guys. And it was just this wonderful image of post-1980 American politics, all done around the image of the cowboy. And it is no longer available on the internet. You can't even get it through the Wayback Machine. Fortunately, I did print it out when it was there.
Wow.
But it really came to symbolize so much of our present politics, that idea of that hardworking guy. But what fascinates me about it is, why is that so attractive when it's not real? And that, I think, is a really important question for us nowadays to grapple with, and certainly as historians to grapple with. What makes that dream, that myth, so very, very attractive when it basically has, at times in America, paved the way for an end to democracy?
Right. So say a little more about that, because, as I'm thinking about the kind of gap between the myth and the actuality of the cattle frontier, there is no cattle frontier without the Transcontinental Railroad. There is no Transcontinental Railroad without the Railroad Act of 1862, where suddenly the federal government takes, or claims a lot of indigenous land, and then starts parceling it out into private hands as fast as it possibly can at bargain basement prices or free. And this is the kind of thing where if you already have some money, you get, the more money you have, the better you will do if you get out there and you can and can claim some of this land that's been expropriated from Native people. So it's really the government that's putting all this wealth into the hands of individuals who then go out and continue to profit off the public domain in a variety of ways. And we can all get really, we can get down into the weeds with grazing leases and all this kind of stuff too. But there's never a cowboy without the state offering a handout, really. And so why now why at this moment in our very toxic, strange, and frightening politics, why would this notion of rugged American individualism be so comforting to people who really have need of a kind of community, of a government that works for them? Why is it so attractive now?
Well, this is one of the things that is literally keeping me up at night because I think that when we are recording this now, about 2.5 weeks into the Biden administration. I actually don't know what day it is, but he's been around for a couple of weeks, and you can see there's been this really big change in the way that Americans are conceiving of the relationship of an individual to the government. And you can see an increasing emphasis on a government that actually works in favor of people, ordinary people. And I'm not going to describe that as a New Deal government because it's really different than the New Deal in a really crucial way, which we could talk about. But where you got the rise of the cowboy really was in 1980, and slightly before that in 1977 when you had Star Wars, which the Star Wars is quite explicitly a space Western, right? And the idea of the individual against this behemoth government, in that case, the empire. And, it had all the tropes. Luke Skywalker doesn't have an education. He wants one, but he can't go to the metropolis. He works as a farmer. The empire comes in, he kills his family. I mean, maybe it's just a spoiler, but if you haven't seen Star Wars at this point, turn us off and go watch it. And then, he gets sort of the force. He doesn't go to school. He's just sort of innately within him is the ability to better all these, to get the best of all these other people. But what you have then is what the reason it takes off in the 1970s is a political story to my mind. And that's that when we look at the flowering of Westerns, TV Westerns after World War II, there's something really important about the timing of that. So, of course, Hollywood did not make Westerns during World War II. I don't believe it made a single Western, if I'm correct, although you're at the Autry, you might want to correct me on that if I'm wrong.
I'll get on the horn with my film scholars and find out. Yeah.
I think it's the only 4-year period in which they did not make a Western. I think the last one is 39 before the war breaks. And I think they might be making one in the 40, but by 41, there's 4 years where I don't believe there's a Western made. Off the top of my head, though, so there's probably somebody out there going, no, there was that other one.
Although Gene was doing win the war commercials too, and a lot of radio and a lot of TV or movie ads for buy war bonds and that kind of thing too. So Kay became he was always a patriotic cowboy. So cowboys being enlisted in the cause of the of patriotism, that goes. He was also the New Deal cowboy. So.
But it's really interesting if you think about why wouldn't the Hollywood have been making Westerns in that period? Well, first of all, because their domestic market was largely women. But second of all, because what are the values that are embraced in America during World War II? That's the period of the GI, the general infantry, the idea that the war is not going to be won by the great generals the way that Mussolini and Hitler are focusing on because of fascism and the idea that some people are better than others. In America, there's constantly an effort from FDR especially, but also on the part of Eisenhower and on the part of all the journalists like Audie Murphy and I'm drawing a blank on actually my favorite, to emphasize that the war is about sort of nameless and faceless individuals. They're not literally nameless and faceless, but they're all just the guy next door, and they're all working together. Well, that's not the kind of thing you lionize in a Western, but after the war, when there is an attempt, when the New Deal under first FDR and then under Truman, and then when Eisenhower adopts the premises of the New Deal and creates his own sort of New Deal called the Middle Way, which gives us the Interstate Highway Act, which until very recently was the largest public works program in American history. What happens is that acceptance of the idea that the government has a role to play regulating business, providing a basic social safety net, and promoting infrastructure, that is known as a liberal consensus. People believe in that. But a lot of very wealthy businessmen do not like the idea of government regulation. They partly don't like the idea of taxes either, but they really don't like the idea of government regulation. And they push back against the New Deal government with the idea that that was a wartime thing, and now we need to go back to the 1920s and get rid of all those, all the regulations and the taxes, and turn infrastructure projects over to private industry. And they keep saying this, and it's not getting any traction because people are like, you're nuts. I love my life. The government's compressing wealth. I've got my house in Levittown. I got 4 kids. They got bikes. We're good here. And what happens is that with the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education, when that comes out, the people who complain about this new liberal consensus on the part of the Democrats, but especially the Republicans at that point, because they had hopes in the Republicans at least, begin to argue that in fact we are reliving a sort of moment like Reconstruction, where the government is redistributing wealth from hardworking white people to African Americans. Mm-hmm. And it's doing so by insisting on desegregation. And that's 54. In 55, you have William F. Buckley Jr. starting National Review, which he says is going to tell the business, the abused businessman side of the story. That's not the adjective he uses. And you increasingly have the association in America of the idea that an activist government is redistributing wealth from white people to Black people. And it's at that moment that you really see this incredible outpouring of Westerns on TV. And of course, it dovetails as well with the Cold War, the idea this is the American, who's going to go ahead and fight back against communism. But those two things come together in the 1950s. And then, of course, they gain momentum in the 1960s until Nixon weaponizes them in 1970 after Kent State in May of 70, in which he also turns against women who are demanding rights. And from that, you get, it's pretty much a straight line from the 50s to Barry Goldwater in 64, running on the idea of taking the country back to an earlier government with his Conscience of a Conservative that's ghostwritten in 1960. But that basically says, let's go back to before the Civil War. Right. And then that's a straight line from that to Nixon and then to Reagan. Of course, Reagan was an early investor in National Review, and he was a big supporter of Goldwater. That's where he gets his real political start, is when he does that TV speech called The Time for Choosing, supporting Goldwater in 64. So there's this direct line from the idea that the government is helping ordinary Americans to attacking that by associating that with American racism, to embracing the idea of the American cowboy, to the rise of Ronald Reagan. And
so there's, so there's been this kind of constant theme of what people nowadays would call the makers and the takers, right? So that's what draws that bright red thread through the whole thing. And I think, what you've done just in the space of just a few minutes is to give us so much deep kind of historical context for the moment that we're living through right now, where as you've shown, that the kind of mobilization of this language of rugged individualism, of hardworking white guys who are trying to fend off a bunch of ungrateful, lazy, parasites in society, the 47%, as Mitt Romney said in the election of 2012. But makers and takers is the language that gets used, and that deserving people need to be rescued from all the bad people who are just parasites on the state. So, you're providing historical context of this type every day. And I just want to know how you do that. How do you manage to write those letters from an American that I wait for every morning? Or if I happen to be having a horrible insomnia attack, I think I maybe read them an hour after you post them at 2 a.m. How do you have the strength to carry on in the face of an onslaught of information and some pretty heavy stuff that you have to write about?
That's actually a good question. And it is worth pointing out that churning out an average of 1,200 words a day for 16 months at this point, I think, is kind of unheard of. People keep saying, oh, you should publish these as a book. And I'm like, please understand that I figure an average of 1,000, which is probably low, words a day. And I've been doing it now since September 15th of 2019. So we're talking about, what's that? September, October, November, December, January, let's say 4 months. So we're talking about 120, 400 and 400, almost 500,000 words. And if you figure a book is about 75,000 words, we're talking, what's that? 7 books?
Yeah.
So it's a very demanding pace. Now, that being said, they're not all good words, which is an important distinction to make. But I think it's, for me, there's 2 things going on, 3 things going on. One is that it's crazy for me too. So, like, instead of me laying in bed going, what just happened? It's actually worth it to me to spend some hours and going, oh, wait, now I understand what's happening with Navalny. I mean, I haven't actually written about Navalny yet, but I'm actually following that really closely. So, so I know, like, when something happens and like the Secretary of State says something, I'm like, oh, that's how it fits in. So that actually puts the ground back under my feet. And I'm happy to tell other people about that. There's also the fact that I think you will empathize with. I am literally writing for that historian in 150 years, who is in the library trying to figure this out. And there are times when I pick up a story and I say, basically in the scheme of things, maybe it doesn't seem important today, but boy, this is a landmark for 100 years from now. So last night, for example, I wrote about somebody calling attention to a story that really had not gotten a lot of press. And is it going to end up to be an important story? I don't know. But if I were writing a history of this in 100 years, I would want to know that. So I put that in there for her. But then the third reason I do it is because I just love watching it come together. I mean, it's so much fun. And I'm getting good at it. I'm actually getting to be a much better writer than I ever was. And it's kind of like, I get to do this every day. I get to go ahead and say, like, look at this story here. And if I change this, then I can move this. I mean, it's like that I get to play Sudoku every single day. The only downside for me is that that there's a lot of pressure if you think about how many people are on the other side of that screen. So I can't think about it. I have to think, oh, what does Ginge want to know tonight? As opposed to what do the 1,000 people in wherever want to think. It's too much to do that.
Well, the discipline of it, I mean, obviously you're feeling the joy of the discipline of that kind of daily manic writing exercise. And there is something, I think, when I've had to write on deadline like that and churn a whole lot of stuff out, you do get to the point where you just feel you get a kind of adrenaline rush from it, as exhausting as it can be. But 15 months of it, that feels a little superhuman to me. One of the things that I loved is that you were quoted in an interview in the New York Times as saying you wanted to write to people who want to come out of an experience of having read something, feeling smarter and not dumber. And I think that's a really important aspect of the work that you're doing, because I do feel smarter and not dumber when I read your newsletters. And I think so many people who are like me, who are looking for good content that puts things in context, this speaks to the importance of the work of both historians, but also people who are scholars who want to communicate to a wider audience. And many, many of the people in our profession don't really care whether they're talking to a lot of people.
That can also be very important. We need those, what a friend of mine says, is the bricks in the wall, the solid things that we stand on. But the thing about being smarter, not dumber, which somebody got very offended by, what I meant by that is that often when I read the news, there's so many stories. It's very hard to understand what's, they give you, I say it's like a soap opera. Like if you don't watch a soap opera and you try and watch one episode of it, you drive everybody nuts because you're like, who's that? Who's Vincent? Who's, what do you, and the same thing is true of the news or baseball. I can't discuss in a baseball game intelligently. I mean, I know how the game's played, but you've dropped me in the middle of a game. I'm like, I wouldn't know who the pitcher was. So when I said that, what I meant was not that other people were necessarily journalists were necessarily writing down to readers, but more that if you don't know, you will notice if you read me that I try and explain absolutely every single term I use and how everybody is related to each other. Because what really jumped out at me is, you may or may not remember this, but a while back, it was in the Obama administration, the senators led by Tom Cotton did not like what Obama had done with Iran. So they wrote a letter to Iran going around the president. And all of a sudden, all the news was talking about the Logan Act. Oh my God, he broke the Logan Act. And nobody explained the Logan Act. And I was like, you are not fooling me. I have taught the first half of US history since 1993. And I do not know what the Logan Act is. Can't somebody give me a hint? And that's all I'm trying to. And then so I looked it up and I'm like, oh, that's it. Well, why didn't you say that? It took 2 sentences. So that's what I meant by that is like instead of saying, oh, the Logan Act, you all know the Logan Act. I'm like, no, I don't know the Logan Act. I try and say, this runs afoul of the Logan Act, which was an act from, was it 1800 when, and so just sort of trying to explain that stuff so people don't feel like our politics and our democracy is a game of inside baseball from which they're excluded.
Well, I think you never go wrong by overestimating or the intelligence and the curiosity of a reader. And I think one of the reasons that you have a lot of readers is because people feel respected by you. And so, I think that's something that as a historian, I appreciate very much. And it's something I've always tried to do in my work. And as somebody who's also a, part-time museum person, I think it's really important to realize we have big audiences for all the knowledge that we have amassed in our lifetime and the learning that we keep doing. And so it's really, I'm grateful to you for being a person who realizes that there are a lot of people out there who understand that they can make use of a usable past.
And you know what's cool about it though is that I have always thought of these as being collaborative, and they really are. I mean, you're saying that I'm not talking down to people, but the reality is I don't know these things either. I mean, I have the skill set to go find the answers. That makes me different than a lot of people who are confused. But I don't know who, like when the whole Ukraine scandal broke, I'm like, who the heck is the assistant director of the national whatever,
Mm-hmm.
And I knew where to find that. I know where to find the documents. But so often I'm like, sort of like E.B. White says, trying to fight my own way out of the paper bag, not sort of helping everybody else fight out of the paper bag. But one of the things that is so cool about writing history, and I think about museum work too, is that there is so much creativity and so many incredibly smart people in this country.
Yeah, for sure.
That they don't have to be in the academy, and they don't have to, for as far as I'm concerned, they don't have to have a college education or whatever. They're very, very smart people, and they see a lot of stuff that I don't. So a great example of that would have been that when the coronavirus first shut down, somebody wrote to me and said, this is a really big deal. He was from Columbus, Ohio. And he said, this is a really big deal. They are shutting down it's Schwarzenegger's bodybuilding organization thing, and they've called it, this is a huge deal. And I'm like, really? So I looked it up and I'm like, yeah, it is a really big deal. It brings hundreds of thousands of people or something to Columbus. And this is the first national thing that has happened. So I put it in the letter. And I would never have heard of that. Well, about 8 months later, I saw a review of coronavirus, and that was tagged as one of the important signs that this was the first major national thing that had been shut down. I said, I would never have either seen that or recognized its import. And this was some guy who's like, I'm not part of this crowd, but I know this is, my gut tells me this is a really big deal. And he was dead right. So the great beauty of these places where we share our experiences and our knowledge, this one of the things that I hope comes out of coronavirus is people's recognition that places like the Autry matter, and books matter, and art matters, and music matters. And we maybe have taken it a bit too much for granted in the past, but it's a great place for us to be pooling our intelligence and our curiosity.
Well, all I can think is that I can't wait till we get the museum back open and we get you out there for a real visit. I've been wanting to have you out there for a program and at the museum forever, and I look forward to being able to do that soon. I certainly have learned a lot from my collaboration with all my colleagues at the Autry. That's been one of the great joys of my life, and it's fun to hear you talk about the collaborative process of the work that you're doing right now, and the great work that you've done for a really long time. I'm so glad that we had a little bit of time to talk, and thank you. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule.
Well, thank you for having me. But now I'm gonna pull something and ask. I'm gonna ask you a question now, and that is, what is your favorite piece at the Autry, and why?
Oh man! So I think my favorite piece at the Autry is piece by Rose Simpson that's now in that Art of the West gallery that you talked about, that Indian motorcycle that has a great Mateo Romero painting over it. That's a painting of his ancestors as photographed by Edward Curtis. And so, it's the gaze reflected back from indigenous people back onto kind of westernizers. But my favorite piece is a piece by Rose Simpson, who is a Santa Clara Pueblo sculptor. She is an absolutely incredibly brilliant sculptor. And it's this big, giant, hulking piece that is like this guy who looks like kind of what does he look like? He looks like kind of a street dude from New Mexico, from Albuquerque or something, but it's this massive, massive, massive sculpture that absolutely dominates all of these other things. And it basically says, I'm in the middle of the gallery of the Art of the West, and the West belongs to me. And I'm a street dude of color, mixed ancestry with a big old hoodie on, and welcome to my world.
That's great.
And, so I love that one. And I love, there's a freeway painting that greets you right when you go in that Art of the West gallery. And I love that because, of course, I'm, a car person. So that's a thing I do. But there's so much to see there. And you'll see there's going to be so much more. And we're rethinking everything. And I look forward to having you come and help us think.
It is, there's so many spectacular museums in this country, but the Autry is one of the best. And, be fun. Maybe just a thought is if we ever get to travel again, to do these conversations, walking through a gallery together.
Oh, we can do that. I can promise you that. And, probably a good bowl of ramen somewhere nearby in the bargain. So show you the West the way it is now.
Sounds great.
The Autry Museum of the American West thanks our members and supporters.